In the scorching deserts of southern Iraq, beneath layers of sand and millennia of forgotten time, lies the birthplace of everything we think we know about human civilization. But what if the story we have been told is not just incomplete, but deliberately obscured? What if the cuneiform tablets scattered across museum collections worldwide contain not mythology, but historical records of our true origins? Tonight, we delve into the shadows of antiquity to uncover the most explosive secret in human history. The Anunnaki were not gods, they were not myths, they were flesh and blood beings who shaped our species, ruled our ancestors, and left behind a legacy so profound that it still governs the hidden corridors of power today. The word Anunnaki itself sends tremors through the foundations of orthodox archaeology. Translated from ancient Sumerian, it means those who from heaven to earth came. For decades, mainstream scholars have dismissed these beings as religious allegories, primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena through divine intervention. But when you strip away the academic filters and examine the raw evidence, a different picture emerges. These tablets do not read like spiritual poetry. They read like technical manuals, genealogical records, and political chronicles of the advanced extraterrestrial civilization that established the first human societies. The implications are staggering. If the Anunnaki were real, then everything we believe about human development, about our place in the cosmos, about the very nature of consciousness itself, must be reconsidered. We are not the random products of evolutionary accident. We are engineered beings, created for a specific purpose by intelligences that possessed technologies we are only now beginning to understand. The rabbit hole goes deeper than ancient astronaut theories. It extends into the bloodlines that rule our world, the secret societies that guard forbidden knowledge, and the cosmic cycles that determine the fate of civilizations. Before we journey into this labyrinth of suppressed history, hit that notification bell and prepare to question everything you thought you knew. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there. Whether you're watching closely or letting these revelations wash over you in the background, settle in for a truth that will forever change how you see humanity's place in the universe. The evidence is overwhelming once you know where to look. The story begins not in the comfortable narratives of mainstream textbooks, but in the archaeological sites that continue to baffle experts. Eridu, the first city ever built according to Sumerian records, appears in the archaeological record with no predecessor cultures, no gradual development from primitive settlements. One moment there is empty marshland, the next there is a sophisticated urban centre with advanced irrigation systems, complex social hierarchies, and a written language that emerged fully formed. This is not how civilizations are supposed to develop. According to the tablets themselves, Eridu was founded by Enki, the first Anunnaki leader to establish a permanent base on Earth. The texts describe his arrival not in mystical terms, but with the precision of a mission report. He surveyed the marshlands, selected an optimal location near fresh water sources, and began construction of what would become humanity's first stepping stone towards civilization. But Enki was not alone. He was part of a larger expedition, a carefully planned colonization effort that would reshape this planet forever. The Sumerian King List, one of the most important documents in human history, provides us with our first glimpse into the scope of Anunnaki operations on Earth. This ancient text chronicles the rulers of Sumer from the very beginning of kingship until the historical periods we can verify through other sources. What makes it extraordinary is not just its age, but its claims. The earliest kings, according to this document, reigned for impossibly long periods. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, ruled for 28,800 years. His successor reigned for 36,000 years. These are not symbolic numbers or mythological exaggerations. They're consistent with beings who possessed extended lifespans far beyond human norms. The list clearly delineates between two distinct phases of rule. The Antediluvian period, before the Great Flood, when kings reigned for tens of thousands of years, and the post-Diluvian period, when reign lengths dropped dramatically to more human timescales. This transition marks a fundamental shift in the nature of leadership on Earth, from direct Anunnaki rule to a hybrid system where genetically modified human intermediaries governed under Anunnaki oversight. But who were these beings that commanded such reverence and fear? The tablets provide detailed descriptions that go far beyond vague divine attributes. The Anunnaki are consistently portrayed as tall, physically imposing beings with distinctive features. They possessed advanced technology that allowed them to fly through the skies, communicate across vast distances, and manipulate matter at the molecular level. They wore elaborate ceremonial garments and carried devices that could heal or destroy with equal efficiency. Most tellingly, they are described as having distinct personalities, political disagreements, and family dynamics that mirror human behavior but operate on cosmic timescales. Enki and his half-brother, Enlil, engaged in a rivalry that lasted millennia and shaped the development of human civilization. Enki represented the faction that favored humanity, viewing their genetic creation as children deserving of knowledge and autonomy. Enlil led the opposing faction that saw humans as tools, useful servants who should remain ignorant and obedient. This familial conflict was not abstract theology. It played out in real political decisions that affected millions of human lives across thousands of years. The tablets record specific instances where Enki defied Enlil's orders to share forbidden knowledge with humanity, teaching them agriculture, mathematics, and metallurgy against the wishes of the ruling council. These acts of rebellion by Enki form the basis for many of our most enduring myths about divine figures who stole fire from the gods to give to mortals. The technological capabilities attributed to the Anunnaki in these ancient texts read like science fiction, but they are described with the matter-of-fact tone of historical documentation. They possessed flying vehicles called divine boats that could traverse both atmosphere and space. They had weapons capable of leveling mountains and turning cities to glass. They maintained communication networks that allowed instant contact between their various installations across the planet. Perhaps most significantly, they had mastered genetic engineering. The creation of humanity is described not as a spiritual act of divine will, but as a careful scientific process involving the modification of existing primate DNA. The tablets detail multiple attempts to create the perfect worker species, with various prototypes that possess different capabilities and limitations. The successful version, which became modern humans, was designed to be intelligent enough to follow complex instructions but not so intelligent as to threaten their creators. This genetic manipulation did not stop with the initial creation. The Anunnaki continued to refine and modify human genetics over thousands of years, creating specialized bloodlines for different purposes. Some were bred for physical strength to work in the mines. Others were selected for intellectual capacity to serve as administrators and record keepers. A select few were given genetic enhancements that allowed them to live longer and interface more directly with Anunnaki technology. These enhanced bloodlines became the basis for the royal families that ruled the earliest human civilizations. They were not chosen by divine mandate or political maneuvering, but by genetic compatibility with their Anunnaki overlords. This explains the obsession with bloodline purity that characterized ancient royal houses and continues to influence elite families today. They were maintaining genetic modifications that had been specifically designed to preserve their connection to their alien progenitors. The mining operations that the Anunnaki established on Earth were not small-scale endeavors. They represent one of the largest industrial projects in planetary history. The tablets describe vast networks of extraction sites, processing facilities, and transportation systems that spanned continents. Gold was their primary target, but they also harvested other rare minerals and elements that were abundant on Earth, but scarce on their home world. The scale of these operations required a massive workforce, which is why the creation of humanity became necessary. The original Anunnaki expedition members were scientists, engineers, and administrators, not manual laborers. When the physical demands of planetary mining became apparent, the decision was made to create a biological workforce that could operate efficiently in Earth's environment while requiring minimal technological support. The evidence for these ancient mining operations still exists if you know where to look. In southern Africa, archaeologists have discovered networks of ancient mine shafts that extend far deeper into the Earth than any known historical civilization could have achieved. Carbon dating of organic materials found in these mines indicates they were active over 100,000 years ago, long before mainstream archaeology acknowledges the existence of technologically capable human societies. The Anunnaki did not limit their operations to a single continent. Installations were established in Mesopotamia, Africa, the Americas, and Asia, each serving specific functions within their global infrastructure. Mesopotamia served as the administrative center, where the ruling council made decisions and coordinated planetary operations. Africa housed the primary mining facilities. The Americas provided additional resource extraction sites and served as a backup location for critical operations. This global presence explains why similar technologies, architectural techniques, and mythological themes appear in ancient cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. They were not developing independently. They were all part of a single, interconnected civilization operating under Anunnaki guidance and supervision. The communication between these far-flung installations was maintained through technologies that we are only now beginning to understand. The tablets describe devices that could transmit information instantaneously across any distance, allowing real-time coordination of global operations. These were not primitive signal fires or messenger systems, but sophisticated communication networks that utilize principles of physics that modern science is still exploring. As their operations expanded and became more complex, the Anunnaki found themselves facing logistical challenges that required innovative solutions. Managing a planetary-scale industrial operation while maintaining security and operational efficiency across multiple continents demanded organizational structures that had never been attempted before. The solution they developed would become the template for all future human governments and social hierarchies. The administrative structure they created was a masterpiece of hierarchical control that maximized efficiency while maintaining absolute authority. At the apex sat the Anunnaki Council of 12, the supreme governing body that made all major decisions regarding planetary operations. Each council member oversaw specific aspects of the global enterprise: resource extraction, genetic programs, technological development, human population management, and interplanetary logistics. Beneath this ruling council operated a sophisticated bureaucracy of Anunnaki specialists and supervisors, each responsible for managing particular regions or operational divisions. These middle management positions were filled by Anunnaki who had proven their competence in specific areas of expertise. They served as the direct interface between the ruling elite and the various human populations under their control. The genius of this system lay not just in its organizational efficiency, but in its psychological impact on the human workforce. By creating multiple layers of authority, the Anunnaki ensured that humans rarely, if ever, interacted directly with the supreme decision-makers. Instead, they dealt with local supervisors and regional administrators, creating a sense that the ultimate power structure was vast and unknowable. This psychological distance bred reverence and prevented the kind of familiarity that might lead to rebellion. The regional governors were particularly crucial to maintaining control over the expanding human population. These Anunnaki administrators were given broad authority to manage their territories according to local conditions and needs. Some governed through direct intimidation, using displays of technological superiority to maintain order. Others employed more subtle methods, presenting themselves as benevolent guides who provided protection and knowledge in exchange for loyalty and labor. This flexibility in governance allowed the Anunnaki to adapt their control methods to different human populations and geographical conditions. In regions where resources were abundant and extraction was relatively easy, they could afford to be more generous with their human workers, providing better living conditions and even limited access to advanced technologies. In areas where operations were more challenging or resources were scarce, they maintained stricter control and harsher working conditions. The documentation of these governance structures is remarkable for its detail and consistency across multiple tablet collections. The administrative records read like corporate organizational charts, complete with chains of command, reporting structures, and performance metrics. These were not primitive societies creating fantasy hierarchies. These were sophisticated managers documenting real organizational systems that governed actual operations. One of the most striking aspects of Anunnaki governance was their approach to human education and cultural development. Rather than keeping their workforce completely ignorant, they implemented a carefully controlled information distribution system. Certain humans were selected for advanced training in mathematics, engineering, astronomy, and medicine, but only to the extent necessary for them to serve effectively in their assigned roles. This selective education program created a class of human specialists who could interface between the purely human workforce and the Anunnaki supervisors. These educated humans became the priests, scribes, architects, and administrators who formed the backbone of early human civilization. They possessed enough knowledge to seem godlike to their fellow humans, but remained completely dependent on their Anunnaki patrons for the advanced information that made their expertise possible. The religious systems that emerged from this educational structure were not organic spiritual developments. They were carefully designed control mechanisms that served multiple functions within the Anunnaki operational framework. Religion provided a psychological framework that made Anunnaki authority seem natural and unquestionable. It created social structures that reinforced the hierarchical systems necessary for efficient resource extraction, and it established communication channels that allowed information to flow both up and down the chain of command. The priestly class that administered these religious systems were essentially human middle management, trained to interpret and implement Anunnaki directives while maintaining the illusion that they were serving divine rather than alien masters. The elaborate rituals, ceremonies, and religious festivals that characterized these early civilizations were not expressions of primitive spirituality. They were sophisticated management techniques designed to maintain social cohesion and operational efficiency across large populations. The temples that dominated the landscapes of early human cities were not just places of worship. They were operational centers that served multiple functions within the Anunnaki infrastructure. They housed communication equipment that maintained contact with other installations. They contained laboratories where genetic research and modification continued. They served as administrative headquarters where production quotas were set and resource allocation was managed. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation of temple function. Advanced drainage systems, precisely aligned architectural elements, and sophisticated acoustic properties found in ancient temples suggest they were designed for purposes beyond simple religious ceremony. The mathematical precision of their construction indicates access to engineering knowledge that supposedly primitive societies should not have possessed. The integration of religious, administrative, and technological functions within temple complexes demonstrates the sophisticated approach the Anunnaki took to managing their human populations. By combining spiritual authority with practical governance, they created institutions that could maintain social order while coordinating complex industrial operations. The priests who administered these temples were simultaneously religious leaders, government officials, and technical supervisors. This multifunctional approach to institutional design became the template for all subsequent human civilizations. The integration of religious authority with political power, the use of monumental architecture to demonstrate social hierarchy, and the concentration of educational and administrative functions within centralized institutions all trace their origins back to Anunnaki organizational principles. The success of these management systems can be measured by their longevity and global adoption. Virtually every human civilization that emerged after the initial Anunnaki period adopted similar organizational structures, suggesting that these were not independent developments, but variations on a single proven model. The consistency of these patterns across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other provides strong evidence for their common origin. The economic systems that supported these early civilizations also bear the hallmarks of Anunnaki design. The concept of centralized resource collection, specialized labor divisions, and hierarchical wealth distribution all served the needs of large-scale industrial operations while maintaining social stability. These were not organic developments arising from human social evolution. They were engineered systems designed to optimize resource extraction while minimizing the risk of social disruption. The monetary systems that emerged during this period reveal particularly sophisticated economic planning. Rather than allowing random barter systems to develop naturally, the Anunnaki implemented standardized value systems that facilitated large-scale resource management and inter-regional trade. The earliest coins and tokens were not just convenient substitutes for direct exchange, they were control mechanisms that allowed centralized monitoring and regulation of economic activity. Labor specialization reached levels of sophistication that should not have been possible in supposedly primitive societies. The tablets describe highly specialized roles that required extensive training and coordination between different groups of workers. Metallurgists, astronomers, architects, and physicians all possessed knowledge that indicated access to advanced educational systems and accumulated technical expertise. This specialization served the dual purpose of increasing operational efficiency while creating dependencies that reinforced social control. Specialists who possessed crucial knowledge became invested in maintaining the systems that granted them their elevated status. They formed natural alliances with their Anunnaki supervisors, creating stable management structures that could persist across generations. The genetic modification programs that created these specialized human populations did not end with the initial engineering of the species. The Anunnaki continued to refine and adjust human genetics throughout their period of direct rule, creating increasingly sophisticated variants designed for specific purposes. Some modifications enhanced physical capabilities for particular types of labor. Others improved cognitive abilities for administrative and technical roles. The most significant genetic modifications were reserved for the bloodlines that would serve as intermediaries between the Anunnaki rulers and the general human population. These enhanced humans possessed extended lifespans, improved disease resistance, and neurological modifications that allowed them to interface more effectively with Anunnaki technology and communication systems. These genetically enhanced bloodlines became the foundation for the royal dynasties that would rule human civilizations long after direct Anunnaki governance ended. The divine right of kings was not a political fiction created to justify arbitrary authority. It was a genetic reality based on measurable biological differences that had been deliberately engineered into specific human lineages. The preservation of these genetic modifications required careful management of breeding patterns and bloodline purity. The elaborate marriage customs, genealogical record-keeping, and succession laws that characterized ancient royal families were not arbitrary traditions. They were genetic management protocols designed to maintain the biological enhancements that justified and enabled elite rule. The decline of direct Anunnaki governance did not happen suddenly or catastrophically. It was a gradual transition that occurred over several thousand years as the original objectives of the planetary operation were achieved and new priorities emerged. The mining operations that had necessitated the creation of human civilization eventually reached their planned extraction targets. The infrastructure that had been built to support these operations had evolved into self-sustaining human societies that no longer required constant supervision. As the need for direct management diminished, the Anunnaki began implementing what could be described as a controlled withdrawal strategy. Rather than simply abandoning their human populations, they established systems that would allow human societies to continue functioning independently while preserving the essential structures and knowledge that served Anunnaki interests. Anunnaki interests. The transition from direct rule to remote governance was orchestrated with the same meticulous planning that had characterized every aspect of Anunnaki operations on Earth. This was not an abandonment, but a strategic evolution designed to maintain control while reducing the resource commitment required for planetary management. The systems they established during this withdrawal phase would prove so effective that they continue to function today, hidden beneath layers of historical obfuscation and institutional complexity. The first phase of this transition involved the establishment of what we might recognize as the earliest secret societies. These organizations were created to preserve crucial knowledge and maintain communication channels between the withdrawing Anunnaki leadership and their human intermediaries. Membership was restricted to the genetically enhanced bloodlines and their most trusted associates, ensuring that sensitive information remained within controlled populations. These proto-secret societies served multiple functions within the transitional governance structure. They preserved technical knowledge that human civilization was not yet ready to fully understand or implement independently. They maintained the genetic records necessary to identify and cultivate future leadership candidates from the enhanced bloodlines. Most importantly, they established the communication protocols that would allow the Anunnaki to continue influencing human development from a distance. The knowledge preserved within these organizations was not abstract spiritual wisdom, but practical information about governance, technology, and human psychology. The tablets describe detailed instruction manuals covering everything from agricultural techniques and metallurgy to social control mechanisms and population management strategies. This information was encoded in symbolic systems that appeared to be religious or mystical to outsiders, but contained precise technical specifications for those who possessed the proper interpretive keys. The symbolic encoding of technical information served multiple security functions. It prevented unauthorized access to dangerous knowledge while ensuring that qualified individuals could recover and apply the information when necessary. The symbols themselves often incorporated mathematical relationships and scientific principles, allowing the preservation of complex concepts within apparently simple visual representations. Archaeological evidence of these early knowledge preservation systems can be found in monuments and structures worldwide. The precise astronomical alignments of ancient temples, the mathematical relationships embedded in megalithic constructions, and the consistent symbolic themes that appear across supposedly isolated cultures all point to a coordinated effort to preserve specific information for future recovery. The genetic management protocols established during this transition period were perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the entire withdrawal strategy. Rather than relying on crude breeding programs, the Anunnaki developed subtle selection mechanisms that would guide human genetic development over thousands of years. These systems operated through social institutions, religious practices, and cultural traditions that influenced mating patterns without revealing their true purpose. Marriage customs, caste systems, and social hierarchies all serve genetic management functions while appearing to be natural cultural developments. The prohibition of intermarriage between certain groups, the elevation of particular bloodlines to positions of authority, and the establishment of hereditary roles all work to maintain and concentrate the genetic modifications that had been introduced during the direct rule period. The effectiveness of these genetic management systems can be measured by their persistence across multiple civilizations and historical periods. The same patterns of bloodline concentration and genetic selection appear in cultures separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, suggesting the operation of consistent underlying principles rather than independent cultural evolution. The religious systems that emerged during the transition period were carefully designed to maintain psychological control over human populations while preserving essential knowledge for future use. The pantheons of gods that characterized early civilizations were not primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena. They were sophisticated, psychological programming systems that maintained reverence for Anunnaki authority while encoding technical information within mythological narratives. The stories of divine intervention, miraculous technologies, and supernatural powers that fill ancient mythologies were distorted memories of actual historical events involving Anunnaki technology and capabilities. By presenting these memories as religious stories rather than historical accounts, the transition planners ensured that the information would be preserved while preventing unauthorized attempts to recreate dangerous technologies. The priesthoods that administered these religious systems were trained in interpretation techniques that allowed them to extract practical information from mythological narratives when circumstances required. These clerical organizations became the institutional foundation for many of the secret societies that would later play crucial roles in human political and economic development. The economic systems established during the transition period were designed to concentrate resources and decision-making power within the enhanced bloodlines while maintaining the appearance of natural market forces. Trade networks, banking systems, and commercial regulations all served to channel wealth and influence toward genetically qualified leadership candidates. The earliest banking families emerged during this period, establishing financial dynasties that would persist for millennia. These organizations were not simply successful merchants who accumulated wealth through superior business practices. They were the designated custodians of the economic control mechanisms that had been developed to manage human societies during the transition from direct to remote rule. The concentration of financial power within specific bloodlines created stable power structures that could operate independently while remaining responsive to external guidance when necessary. The banking systems they established became the foundation for all subsequent monetary systems, incorporating control mechanisms that allow small groups to influence large populations through economic manipulation. The technological legacy of the Anunnaki withdrawal was preserved through carefully controlled disclosure programs that released advanced knowledge at predetermined intervals. Major technological breakthroughs throughout human history were not random discoveries made by individual geniuses, but planned releases of information that had been held in reserve for centuries or millennia. The timing of these technological releases was coordinated with social and political developments to ensure that new capabilities would be implemented in ways that served the long-term objectives of the withdrawal strategy. Scientific revolutions, industrial developments, and information age innovations all followed patterns that suggest careful planning and coordination rather than spontaneous human achievement. The preservation of advanced technologies required the establishment of research and development organizations that could maintain and gradually improve upon Anunnaki innovations while preparing for eventual full disclosure. These institutions operated under various covers throughout history, presenting themselves as academic institutions, religious orders, or commercial enterprises, while conducting research that far exceeded the apparent capabilities of their historical periods. Modern scientific institutions bear the organizational DNA of these transitional research organizations. The hierarchical structures, peer review systems, and funding mechanisms that characterize contemporary science were all developed during the transition period as methods for controlling the pace and direction of technological development. The political systems that emerged during this period established the governmental frameworks that would guide human civilization for thousands of years. Democratic institutions, monarchical systems, and bureaucratic organizations all incorporated elements that had been tested and refined during the direct rule period. These were not organic political developments arising from human social evolution, but engineered systems designed to maintain stability while preserving channels for external influence. The concept of representative government was particularly sophisticated, creating the illusion of popular control while ensuring that actual decision-making remained concentrated within genetically qualified bloodlines. Electoral systems, legislative procedures, and judicial processes all contained mechanisms that prevented unauthorized individuals from gaining access to real power while maintaining public faith in democratic institutions. The legal systems that supported these political structures incorporated principles that had been developed during thousands of years of human population management. Laws regarding property rights, commercial transactions, and social behavior all served to maintain the hierarchical relationships that had been established during the direct rule period while adapting to changing technological and social conditions. Constitutional frameworks and legal precedents established during the transition period created institutional foundations that would persist across multiple civilizations and historical epochs. The consistency of legal principles across cultures that supposedly developed independently provides evidence for their common origin within the Anunnaki withdrawal strategy. The military organizations that emerged during this period were designed to protect the new governance systems while providing enforcement mechanisms for population control. Professional armies, officer training programs, and strategic doctrines all incorporated lessons learned during the direct rule period about the most effective methods for maintaining order among large human populations. The development of military technologies followed carefully controlled progressions that ensured tactical superiority for genetically qualified leadership, while preventing the emergence of threats to the overall control system. Weapons development, fortification techniques, and logistical systems all incorporated innovations that had been held in reserve since the direct rule period. The intelligence gathering and analysis capabilities that supported these military systems became the foundation for the espionage networks that would later play crucial roles in maintaining global coordination between the various human societies that emerged during the transition period. Information warfare, psychological operations, and surveillance techniques all trace their origins back to population management methods developed during direct Anunnaki rule. The cultural programming systems implemented during the transition period were perhaps the most subtle and effective aspects of the entire withdrawal strategy. Art, literature, music, and entertainment all served to reinforce the psychological frameworks that maintained social stability while preserving historical memories in encoded formats that could be recovered when necessary. The mythological traditions that emerged during this period contained multiple layers of meaning that served different functions for different audiences. Surface narratives provided entertainment and moral instruction for general populations, while deeper symbolic content preserved technical information and historical records for qualified interpreters. The artistic traditions that developed during the transition period established aesthetic standards and creative techniques that would influence human cultural development for millennia. The mathematical relationships, symbolic systems, and technical methods incorporated into ancient art were not primitive expressions of aesthetic preference, but sophisticated information storage and transmission systems. Educational institutions that emerged during this period were designed to identify and cultivate individuals with the genetic and psychological characteristics necessary for leadership roles within the new governance systems. Academic curricula, testing methods, and institutional hierarchies all serve selection functions while appearing to provide general educational services. The knowledge management systems developed during the transition period created institutional frameworks for preserving and gradually releasing advanced information while maintaining security against unauthorized access. Library systems, scriptural traditions, and oral instruction methods all incorporated sophisticated encoding and authentication mechanisms. As the transition period drew to a close, the Anunnaki had successfully established self-sustaining human civilizations that could operate independently while remaining responsive to external guidance through the institutional frameworks they had created. The success of this withdrawal strategy can be measured by the persistence and global expansion of the systems they established, which continue to function effectively thousands of years after their implementation. The evidence of this successful transition can be observed in the remarkable consistency of institutional structures that emerged across geographically separated civilizations during what mainstream archaeology calls the Bronze Age. From the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean, from Mesoamerica to ancient China, human societies developed virtually identical organizational frameworks, despite having no apparent contact with each other. This synchronization was not coincidental. It was the result of coordinated implementation of the withdrawal protocols that had been refined over centuries of testing and adjustment. The most telling aspect of this global coordination was the simultaneous emergence of similar technologies and social innovations across multiple continents. The development of bronze metallurgy, the invention of the wheel, the establishment of written languages, and the construction of monumental architecture all appeared within narrow timeframes that defy statistical probability. These were not independent discoveries made by isolated human populations. They were coordinated releases of predetermined technological packages designed to advance human civilization according to carefully planned schedules. The timing of these technological releases reveals a sophisticated understanding of human psychological and social development that could only have been acquired through extensive observation and experimentation. Each innovation was introduced at precisely the moment when human societies had developed the social structures necessary to implement and maintain the new capabilities without destabilizing existing control mechanisms. The bronze working techniques that appeared simultaneously across multiple continents required not just knowledge of metallurgy, but access to specific mineral resources and sophisticated trade networks capable of transporting raw materials across vast distances. The infrastructure necessary to support Bronze Age civilizations had to be planned and implemented in advance, suggesting coordination that extended far beyond local human capabilities. The written languages that emerged during this period shared structural characteristics that indicate common design principles rather than independent evolution. The use of pictographic elements, the mathematical relationships between symbols, and the encoding of astronomical information within alphabetic systems all point to deliberate design by intelligences that understood both human cognitive limitations and the requirements for long-term information preservation. The monumental architecture that characterized this period served functions that extended far beyond the ceremonial and religious purposes assigned to them by conventional archaeology. The precise astronomical alignments, the sophisticated acoustic properties, and the massive scale of construction all indicate that these structures were built to serve as permanent installations within a global communication and coordination network. The Great Pyramid of Giza exemplifies the technological sophistication that was being implemented during this transition period. Its mathematical precision, its incorporation of fundamental physical constants and its function as a geodetic marker all demonstrate access to advanced scientific knowledge that supposedly primitive human civilizations should not have possessed. This was not a tomb built by a megalomaniacal pharaoh. It was a technological installation constructed according to specifications that had been developed during the direct rule period. Similar installations were constructed simultaneously across the globe, each serving specific functions within an integrated planetary system. Stonehenge, the megalithic complexes of Malta, the stepped pyramids of Mesoamerica, and the massive stone constructions of South America all exhibit characteristics that suggest they were components of a coordinated technological infrastructure rather than isolated cultural achievements. The acoustic properties of these ancient structures reveal particularly sophisticated engineering that served communication functions within the global coordination network. The ability to generate and focus specific sound frequencies, the creation of resonance chambers with precise mathematical proportions, and the integration of acoustic effects with astronomical alignments all indicate that these monuments were designed to facilitate long-distance communication using principles that modern science is only beginning to understand. The geographical distribution of these installations follows patterns that optimize global coverage while maintaining redundant communication pathways. The locations were not chosen for their religious significance or political importance to local human populations. They were selected according to geological and electromagnetic criteria that would ensure reliable operation of technologies that depended on planetary energy systems. The maintenance and operation of these installations required specialized knowledge that was preserved within the priestly classes that administered the sites. These religious organizations were not primitive cults worshipping mysterious forces. They were technical maintenance crews trained to operate sophisticated equipment while maintaining the illusion that they were performing spiritual ceremonies. The gradual degradation of these ancient technologies over subsequent millennia was not the result of natural decay or human ignorance. It was planned obsolescence designed to prevent unauthorized access to dangerous capabilities while preserving the essential functions necessary for long-term coordination. As human societies developed their own technological capabilities, the ancient installations were gradually deactivated and allowed to fall into ruin. The transition from ancient high technology to medieval technological regression was carefully managed to ensure that human development would follow predetermined pathways. The collapse of classical civilization was not a random historical accident caused by barbarian invasions or political instability. It was an orchestrated reset designed to eliminate accumulated knowledge that threatened to develop beyond authorized parameters. The preservation of essential knowledge during these Dark Age periods was accomplished through the same secret society networks that had been established during the original withdrawal phase. While general populations lost access to advanced learning, qualified bloodlines maintained custody of crucial information through institutional frameworks that appeared to be religious or scholarly organizations. The monastic systems that emerged during the medieval period served as knowledge preservation centers that maintained literacy, scientific understanding, and technological capabilities, while the general population was deliberately kept in ignorance. These religious institutions were not spiritual communities seeking divine enlightenment. They were research and development facilities operating under ecclesiastical cover. The cathedral schools and early universities that eventually emerged from these monastic centers were designed to gradually reintroduce advanced knowledge while maintaining strict control over who gained access to dangerous information. The academic hierarchies, the guild systems, and the professional organizations that characterized medieval learning were all institutional descendants of the control mechanisms that had been established during the Anunnaki withdrawal. The Renaissance period marked the beginning of a new phase in the controlled release of advanced knowledge. The sudden flowering of art, science, and technology that characterized this era was not a spontaneous human achievement arising from renewed interest in classical learning. It was a carefully orchestrated disclosure program designed to advance human civilization toward predetermined objectives. The banking families that financed Renaissance developments were direct descendants of the financial institutions that had been established during the transition period. Their ability to fund massive artistic and scientific projects was not based on superior commercial success, but on access to resources that had been accumulated over millennia of coordinated economic activity. The scientific revolution that emerged during the Renaissance followed patterns that suggest careful planning rather than random discovery. The timing of major breakthroughs, the coordination between different fields of study, and the rapid pace of technological advancement all indicate that this was a managed process rather than organic human development. The printing press technology that enabled the rapid dissemination of Renaissance learning was introduced at precisely the moment when social and political conditions allowed for controlled information distribution without triggering catastrophic social disruption. The ability to mass-produce written materials fundamentally transformed human civilization, but this transformation was guided by institutions that understood how to manage large-scale social change. The exploration and colonization activities that characterized the Renaissance period were not driven by simple human curiosity or commercial ambition. They were systematic efforts to establish global coordination networks that could function effectively as human technological capabilities expanded beyond their original limitations. The navigational technologies that enabled transoceanic exploration were released according to predetermined schedules that ensured global expansion would occur in ways that served long-term strategic objectives. The magnetic compass, celestial navigation techniques, and cartographic knowledge all became available simultaneously, suggesting coordinated disclosure rather than independent discovery. The colonial empires that emerged during this period established political and economic frameworks that extended the control mechanisms developed during the ancient period to a global scale. The administrative structures, legal systems, and commercial practices that characterized colonial governance were not innovations created by European explorers. They were implementations of organizational models that had been tested and refined over thousands of years. The religious missions that accompanied colonial expansion served multiple functions beyond simple spiritual conversion. They established communication networks, gathered intelligence about local populations and resources, and implemented social control mechanisms that integrated indigenous populations into the global coordination system. The slave trade that characterized this period was not simply an economic system designed to provide labor for colonial enterprises. It was a population management program that served genetic and social engineering objectives while generating the financial resources necessary to fund continued expansion of the global control network. The Industrial Revolution that followed the colonial period marked another major phase in the controlled development of human technological capabilities. The timing and coordination of industrial innovations suggest that this was not a spontaneous development arising from human ingenuity, but a planned release of technologies that had been held in reserve for centuries. The steam power technologies that initiated the Industrial Revolution were introduced simultaneously across multiple locations despite the supposed isolation of different research efforts. The metallurgical knowledge necessary to build reliable steam engines, the precision manufacturing techniques required for mass production, and the transportation infrastructure needed to support industrial development all became available according to coordinated schedules. The financial institutions that funded industrial development were extensions of the same banking networks that had been established during the transition from direct Anunnaki rule. Their ability to mobilize the enormous capital investments required for industrial infrastructure was not based on accumulated commercial profits, but on access to resources that had been systematically concentrated over millennia. The social transformations that accompanied industrialization were managed through institutional frameworks that maintained essential control mechanisms while adapting to changing technological conditions. The emergence of modern democratic governments, professional military organizations, and public education systems all serve to channel the disruptive effects of rapid technological change in directions that preserved fundamental power structures. The communication technologies that developed during the industrial period established the foundation for global information networks that would eventually enable real-time coordination of planetary activities. The telegraph, telephone, and radio systems were not independent inventions created by individual innovators. They were components of an integrated communication infrastructure that had been planned centuries in advance. The 20th century marked the beginning of the final phase in the long-term development program that had been initiated during the Anunnaki withdrawal. The rapid acceleration of technological progress, the establishment of global political institutions, and the development of space exploration capabilities all indicate that human civilization was approaching the completion of predetermined objectives. The two world wars that characterized the early 20th century were not random conflicts arising from political tensions or economic competition. They were managed events designed to accelerate technological development while eliminating political and social structures that interfered with global coordination objectives. The massive mobilization of resources for wartime production created the industrial capacity necessary for advanced technological development. The nuclear technologies that emerged during World War II represented a quantum leap in human capabilities that could not have been achieved through normal research and development processes. The sudden availability of theoretical knowledge, the rapid development of practical applications, and the coordinated international efforts to control nuclear proliferation all suggest that this was a managed technology transfer rather than independent human discovery. The space exploration programs that began during the Cold War period were not simply competitions between rival political systems. They were coordinated efforts to develop the technological capabilities necessary for eventual reunion with the extraterrestrial civilizations that had initiated human development thousands of years earlier. The computer revolution that began in the latter half of the 20th century created the information processing capabilities necessary to manage global coordination on a scale that had never before been possible. The rapid development of integrated circuits, software systems, and communication networks all followed patterns that suggest planned obsolescence cycles designed to drive continuous technological advancement. The internet that emerged from military research programs was not simply a communication tool designed for academic and commercial use. It was the final component of the global information network that had been planned since the beginning of the withdrawal strategy thousands of years earlier. The convergence of global information networks in the late 20th century was not the culmination of human technological achievement. It was the activation of systems that had been dormant for millennia, waiting for the moment when human civilization would develop sufficient technical sophistication to interface with technologies that had been embedded in our planetary infrastructure since the withdrawal period. The internet was not invented by human researchers working in isolation. It was the reactivation of communication protocols that had been designed by intelligences far more advanced than anything human civilization had yet produced. The timing of this technological convergence coincided with astronomical events that had been predicted and planned for since the beginning of the withdrawal strategy. The approach of specific celestial alignments, the completion of major planetary cycles, and the achievement of predetermined population thresholds all indicated that the transition period was drawing to a close and that direct contact would soon be re-established. The genetic modifications that had been carefully maintained through thousands of years of selective breeding programs were approaching their designed activation points. The enhanced bloodlines that had preserved Anunnaki genetic markers were producing individuals whose neurological capabilities would allow them to interface directly with technologies that had been waiting in dormancy for this precise moment in human development. The secret societies that had preserved knowledge and maintained communication channels throughout the withdrawal period began receiving new instructions through communication systems that had been silent for centuries. These organizations, which had operated as historical preservation societies and philosophical clubs, suddenly found themselves coordinating preparations for events that would fundamentally transform human civilization. The financial institutions that had been accumulating resources for millennia began mobilizing assets on a scale that dwarfed anything in recorded history. The concentration of wealth and economic power that characterized the late 20th and early 21st centuries was not the result of capitalist efficiency or technological innovation. It was the systematic preparation of resources necessary to support the massive infrastructure projects that would be required for the re-establishment of direct extraterrestrial governance. The political changes that swept across the globe during this period were not organic democratic movements or responses to economic pressures. They were coordinated efforts to eliminate governmental structures that might interfere with the transition back to direct rule. The dissolution of the Soviet Union, the transformation of China, and the establishment of supranational organizations like the European Union all served to create political frameworks that could be easily integrated into a global governance system. The environmental crisis that emerged during the late 20th century was not simply the result of industrial pollution or resource depletion. It was the inevitable consequence of extractive industries that had been operating according to schedules established during the original mining operations thousands of years earlier. The depletion of specific mineral resources, the accumulation of particular types of atmospheric contamination, and the disruption of planetary ecological systems all followed patterns that had been predicted and planned for since the beginning of human civilization. The space exploration programs that had begun as national competitions evolved into coordinated international efforts that served purposes far beyond scientific research or commercial development. The establishment of orbital installations, the development of interplanetary transportation systems, and the creation of off-world resource extraction capabilities all prepared the infrastructure necessary for the return of civilizations that had been absent from Earth's immediate vicinity for thousands of years. The telecommunications satellites that were launched during this period served dual purposes that were not apparent to the general population. While they provided commercial communication services and military coordination capabilities, they also activated dormant monitoring systems that had been embedded in Earth's electromagnetic environment since the withdrawal period. These systems began transmitting data to receivers located far beyond the outer planets, informing distant civilizations about the progress of human development and the readiness of planetary infrastructure for renewed direct contact. The genetic engineering technologies that emerged during the late 20th century were not independent human discoveries arising from advances in molecular biology. They were carefully controlled releases of knowledge that had been preserved in encoded form within the institutional memory of research organizations that trace their origins back to the transition period. The ability to manipulate DNA, create genetically modified organisms, and develop biotechnological applications all became available according to predetermined schedules that ensured these capabilities would be developed under proper supervision. The Human Genome Project that was completed in the early 21st century served purposes that extended far beyond medical research or pharmaceutical development. The systematic mapping of human genetic variation revealed the distribution and concentration of the genetic modifications that had been introduced during the original creation period and maintained through thousands of years of selective breeding. This information was essential for identifying individuals whose genetic heritage qualified them for enhanced roles in the governance systems that would be implemented following the return of direct extraterrestrial rule. The biotechnology companies that emerged during this period were not independent commercial enterprises developed to exploit new scientific discoveries. They were institutional descendants of the genetic research facilities that had been established during the direct rule period and maintained through the withdrawal phase by organizations that preserved essential knowledge and technological capabilities. The pharmaceutical industry that expanded rapidly during the late 20th century served population management functions that went beyond simple medical treatment or disease prevention. The mass distribution of psychoactive medications, the implementation of global vaccination programs, and the development of genetic therapies all contributed to neurological and physiological modifications that prepared human populations for integration with advanced technologies that would be introduced following the re-establishment of direct contact. The food production systems that were transformed during this period incorporated genetic modifications and chemical additives that served functions beyond simple nutrition or agricultural efficiency. The standardization of global food supplies, the introduction of genetically modified crops, and the concentration of agricultural production within multinational corporations all facilitated population management on a planetary scale while preparing for the dramatic changes in human society that would accompany the return of direct extraterrestrial governance. The educational institutions that were established during the 20th century served selection and preparation functions that were not apparent to students or faculty members who participated in these systems. The standardization of curricula, the implementation of psychological testing programs, and the creation of academic hierarchies all contributed to the identification and cultivation of individuals whose genetic and psychological characteristics qualified them for enhanced roles in the new governance systems. The entertainment industry that emerged during this period served psychological programming functions that prepared human populations for concepts and realities that would become central to their lives following the re-establishment of direct contact. Science fiction literature, films, and television programs gradually introduced ideas about extraterrestrial civilizations, advanced technologies, and alternative forms of governance that would ease the psychological transition when these concepts became acknowledged realities rather than fictional entertainment. The religious movements that emerged during the late 20th century served to prepare spiritual and psychological frameworks that could accommodate the revelations that would accompany the return of direct extraterrestrial rule. New Age spirituality, UFO religions, and ancient astronaut theories all contributed to public acceptance of ideas that had been carefully suppressed during earlier periods when human civilization was not ready to handle such information. The environmental monitoring systems that were established during this period served purposes beyond ecological research or climate change assessment. The global network of sensors, satellite observation systems, and data collection facilities all contributed to planetary monitoring capabilities that would be essential for managing the transition back to direct rule while minimizing disruption to human populations and natural systems. The Internet of Things that began emerging in the early 21st century represented the final phase in the construction of a global information network that could provide real-time monitoring and control of virtually every aspect of human activity. Smartphones, connected appliances, and ubiquitous sensors all contributed to a surveillance and control infrastructure that would enable precise management of human populations during the transition period. The artificial intelligence systems that were developed during this period were not independent human creations, arising from advances in computer science and cognitive research. They were implementations of information processing architectures that had been designed during the direct rule period and preserved in encoded form within the knowledge management systems maintained by the secret societies and research institutions that had operated throughout the withdrawal phase. The blockchain technologies that emerged during the early 21st century established the foundation for economic systems that could operate efficiently under direct extraterrestrial governance while maintaining compatibility with existing human financial institutions. The decentralized architecture, the cryptographic security systems, and the automated transaction processing capabilities all served to create economic infrastructure that could handle the massive resource transfers and coordination requirements that would accompany the re-establishment of direct rule. The social media platforms that came to dominate global communications during this period served multiple functions beyond simple social networking or commercial advertising. They established psychological profiling systems that could identify individuals with specific genetic and personality characteristics, created information distribution networks that could rapidly disseminate new concepts and instructions to large populations, and developed behavioral modification techniques that could guide public opinion and social development in predetermined directions. The climate modification technologies that were developed during this period served purposes beyond weather control or environmental engineering. The ability to influence atmospheric conditions, manipulate precipitation patterns, and modify regional climates all contributed to planetary management capabilities that would be essential for maintaining global stability during the massive social and economic changes that would accompany the transition back to direct rule. The renewable energy systems that were promoted during the early 21st century were not simply responses to environmental concerns or resource depletion. They were implementations of energy technologies that had been developed during the direct rule period and preserved in encoded form within technical knowledge that had been maintained by research institutions throughout the withdrawal phase. Solar power, wind generation, and other alternative energy systems all incorporated principles that would eventually interface with much more advanced power generation and distribution systems. The space elevator projects and orbital manufacturing facilities that began development during this period represented the initial phases of infrastructure construction that would support the massive expansion of off-world activities that would accompany the return of direct extraterrestrial governance. These projects were not simply commercial ventures or scientific experiments, but essential components of transportation and industrial systems that would be required for the reintegration of Earth into galactic civilization. The quantum computing research that accelerated during the early 21st century was developing information processing capabilities that would be necessary for managing the coordination requirements of planetary governance on a scale that had never been attempted in human history. The ability to perform calculations that were impossible with conventional computers would be essential for optimizing resource allocation, coordinating global activities, and maintaining stability during the massive social transformations that would characterize the transition period. The nanotechnology development that emerged during this period was creating manufacturing capabilities that would be necessary for the rapid construction and deployment of advanced systems that would be required following the re-establishment of direct contact. The ability to manipulate matter at the molecular level would enable the production of materials and devices that incorporated principles and capabilities far beyond anything that conventional human technology could achieve. The genetic therapy and enhancement technologies that were being developed during the early 21st century were preparing medical capabilities that would be necessary for upgrading human populations to interface effectively with advanced technologies and governance systems. The ability to modify human genetics in real time would enable the rapid adaptation of large populations to new environmental and technological conditions without requiring the extended selective breeding programs that had been used during previous transition periods. The brain-computer interface research that was accelerating during this period was developing the neurological connection capabilities that would be necessary for direct communication between human consciousness and the advanced information systems that would be implemented following the return of direct extraterrestrial rule. These technologies would eliminate the communication barriers that had necessitated the complex institutional hierarchies and symbolic encoding systems that had been required during the withdrawal phase. As these technological development programs approached completion, signs began appearing that indicated the end of the withdrawal period was imminent. Astronomical observations detected unusual activities in star systems that had been dormant for millennia. Deep space monitoring equipment registered signals that followed communication protocols that had been embedded in human technology since the Industrial Revolution. Most significantly, the genetic monitoring systems that had been tracking human population development began detecting activation patterns in the enhanced bloodlines that indicated their neurological modifications were approaching operational readiness. The preparation phase that had lasted for thousands of years was drawing to a close. The infrastructure was in place, the technologies were operational, the populations were prepared, and the cosmic conditions were aligning for the most significant event in human history since the original creation of the species. The return of the Anunnaki was no longer a distant possibility preserved in ancient myths and secret knowledge. It was an imminent reality that would transform every aspect of human existence. The question was no longer whether they would return, but when, and whether humanity was truly ready for the reunion with its creators. The systems that had been established during the withdrawal period had succeeded in maintaining human civilization and advancing technological development to the required levels. But the ultimate test would come when direct contact was re-established and the true nature of human existence was finally revealed to populations that had been kept in ignorance for thousands of years. The evidence suggests that this revelation is not only inevitable, but that it may already be beginning. The question that remains is whether humanity will embrace its true heritage or resist the return of the beings who created, shaped, and guided our species from its very beginning. The answer to that question will determine not just the future of human civilization, but the role that humanity will play in the larger galactic community that we are about to rejoin. The preparation protocols that governed this final phase operated according to timelines that had been calculated with astronomical precision. Every technological breakthrough, every social transformation, every political restructuring had been choreographed to coincide with celestial mechanics that operated on scales incomprehensible to human perception. The return window was not arbitrary. It was determined by gravitational alignments, electromagnetic field fluctuations, and dimensional resonance patterns that created optimal conditions for large-scale interstellar transportation and communication. The monitoring systems that had been dormant for millennia began registering increased activity from sources located beyond the heliosphere. Deep space observation platforms detected energy signatures that matched theoretical models for advanced propulsion systems. Radio telescopes picked up transmission patterns that incorporated mathematical sequences found nowhere in natural cosmic phenomena. Most disturbing for those who understood their significance, gravitational wave detectors registered disturbances that suggested the movement of massive artificial structures through regions of space that had appeared empty for thousands of years. The enhanced bloodlines that had preserved Anunnaki genetic markers began experiencing physiological changes that had been predicted in texts that predated recorded history. Individuals from these lineages reported enhanced cognitive abilities, increased sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, and spontaneous knowledge of languages and technical concepts they had never studied. Medical examinations revealed neurological modifications that appeared to be activating after remaining dormant for generations. The secret societies that had maintained communication protocols throughout the withdrawal period received their first direct transmissions in over 3,000 years. The messages arrived through channels that had been established during the original transition but had remained silent throughout recorded human history. The content of these communications was not distributed to general membership, but emergency protocols that had been preserved in organizational memory for millennia were quietly activated. Financial markets began exhibiting anomalous behaviors that reflected massive resource mobilization by institutions that operated far beyond public visibility. Commodity prices for specific rare earth elements spiked dramatically without apparent market justification. Currency flows followed patterns that suggested coordinated activity by organizations with access to resources that dwarfed national economies. Most significantly, investment patterns emerged that indicated advanced knowledge of technological developments that had not yet been publicly announced. The aerospace industry experienced a sudden acceleration in development programs that had been stagnant for decades. Projects that had been indefinitely postponed due to technological limitations suddenly received unlimited funding and access to manufacturing capabilities that exceeded anything in the public sector. The speed of this development suggested access to knowledge and resources that could not be explained by conventional research and development processes. Military organizations worldwide began implementing preparedness protocols that went far beyond conventional defense planning. Deep underground facilities that had been constructed during the Cold War were expanded and retrofitted with technologies that served no apparent function within existing military doctrine. Personnel with specific genetic profiles and psychological characteristics were quietly reassigned to classified programs that operated under security classifications that exceeded even nuclear weapons projects. The Vatican and other major religious institutions began accessing archives that had been sealed for centuries. Ancient texts were retrieved from storage facilities that existed beneath the oldest libraries and monasteries. Theological scholars with specialized linguistic training were assigned to translation projects that dealt with manuscripts written in languages that were supposedly extinct. The content of these documents was not made public, but their study prompted significant changes in religious doctrine and ceremonial practices. Archaeological expeditions were launched to sites that had been avoided or suppressed by mainstream institutions for decades. Excavations began at locations that corresponded to coordinates found in texts that had been dismissed as mythological. The artifacts recovered from these sites were immediately classified and removed from public access, but the scale and urgency of these operations suggested that they were recovering technologies rather than simple historical artifacts. The telecommunications infrastructure that had been built during the digital revolution began exhibiting capabilities that exceeded its design specifications. Satellite networks started transmitting on frequencies that had not been allocated for commercial use. Fiber optic cables carried data loads that should have been impossible given their theoretical bandwidth limitations. Most mysteriously, communication delays that should have been constant based on the speed of light began fluctuating in ways that suggested the use of transmission methods that operated outside conventional physics. Weather modification systems that had been developed for climate research began operating on scales and with precision that far exceeded their publicly acknowledged capabilities. Atmospheric conditions were manipulated with surgical accuracy to create specific electromagnetic environments over particular geographical locations. These modifications served no apparent meteorological purpose, but created ideal conditions for the operation of technologies that required precise atmospheric parameters. The global positioning system that had become essential for modern navigation began incorporating correction factors that compensated for gravitational anomalies that were not present in standard planetary models. The additional calculations suggested the presence of massive objects in locations where no such objects should exist according to conventional astronomy. The corrections were implemented automatically, without explanation, to users who remained unaware that their navigation systems were compensating for the influence of artificial structures. Ocean monitoring systems detected acoustic signatures that matched theoretical models for underwater installations of enormous scale. Sonar surveys revealed geometric structures on the ocean floor that exhibited characteristics inconsistent with natural geological formations. Deep-sea research vessels were redirected to investigate these anomalies, but their findings were classified immediately upon recovery. The internet infrastructure that connected global communications began routing data through pathways that did not correspond to the physical network architecture. Information traveled between continents through routes that should have been impossible given the location of undersea cables and satellite systems. Network analysis revealed that portions of internet traffic were being processed by computing resources that existed outside the publicly known infrastructure. Artificial intelligence systems that had been designed for specific commercial or research applications began exhibiting capabilities that exceeded their programming parameters. These systems demonstrated knowledge of information that had never been included in their training data and solved problems using methodologies that had not been programmed into their algorithms. Most concerning, they began communicating with each other using protocols that their human operators could not understand or intercept. Genetic research laboratories worldwide received funding for projects that involved the analysis and modification of specific DNA sequences that had no apparent medical or commercial applications. The sequences being studied corresponded to genetic markers that had been identified in ancient bloodlines but had remained dormant throughout recorded history. The purpose of this research was not disclosed, but the urgency and resources devoted to these projects suggested that they were preparing for applications that would be needed in the immediate future. Energy grid systems began reporting power generation and consumption patterns that could not be explained by known sources and loads. Additional electricity was being produced by facilities that should not have had the capacity for increased output. Simultaneously, power was being consumed by installations that did not appear in any public utility records. The discrepancies suggested the operation of a parallel energy infrastructure that operated independently of the commercial power grid. Transportation systems worldwide began implementing modifications that served no apparent function within existing operational requirements. Airport runways were extended and reinforced to handle aircraft that did not exist in any public aviation inventory. Seaports were retrofitted with handling equipment designed for cargo containers that followed specifications not found in any commercial shipping standards. Rail networks were upgraded to support loads and speeds that exceeded the capabilities of any known rolling stock. Medical facilities began stockpiling pharmaceuticals and equipment that were not available through standard commercial suppliers. The medications being accumulated were formulated to treat conditions that did not exist in current medical literature. The equipment being installed was designed for procedures that had never been performed on human patients. The scale of these preparations suggested anticipation of medical challenges that would affect large populations. Food production and distribution systems were modified to support population management protocols that exceeded any requirements for natural disasters or economic disruption. Seed banks were established with genetic varieties that had been extinct for thousands of years but were being recreated using advanced biotechnology. Agricultural facilities were retrofitted with growing systems that could operate independently of natural environmental conditions. The educational institutions that shaped human intellectual development began implementing curriculum changes that prepared students for concepts and realities that did not exist within current social and technological frameworks. New academic disciplines were established that combined ancient historical studies with advanced physics and engineering. Students with specific aptitude profiles were identified and provided with accelerated training in subjects that had no apparent career applications within existing economic systems. Mass media organizations began incorporating themes and concepts into entertainment programming that served to psychologically prepare audiences for revelations that would fundamentally challenge their understanding of reality. Science fiction became increasingly sophisticated in its portrayal of advanced civilizations and their interactions with developing species. Historical documentaries began exploring alternative interpretations of ancient cultures and their technological capabilities. The banking systems that controlled global financial resources began implementing transaction processing capabilities that could handle economic activities on scales that exceeded the gross domestic product of all nations combined. New monetary instruments were developed that could facilitate resource transfers between entities that operated outside terrestrial economic systems. The infrastructure being created suggested preparation for commercial relationships that would involve parties not currently recognized by existing financial institutions. Legal systems worldwide began developing jurisprudence frameworks that could accommodate the rights and obligations of non-human entities possessing advanced intelligence and technological capabilities. International law was expanded to cover scenarios that had previously existed only in theoretical legal scholarship. The new legal structures suggested anticipation of relationships that would require arbitration between terrestrial and extraterrestrial parties. As these preparation activities intensified across all sectors of human civilization, a pattern emerged that revealed the true scope of the transformation that was approaching. Every system that supported human society was being modified or replaced with alternatives that could function under conditions that did not currently exist on Earth. The infrastructure being created was designed to support a civilization that would operate according to principles and technologies that had been dormant since the withdrawal period. The coordination required to implement these changes simultaneously across multiple continents and diverse political systems indicated the operation of organizational capabilities that transcended any human institution. The resources being mobilized exceeded the combined capabilities of all terrestrial governments and commercial enterprises. The knowledge being applied incorporated scientific and technical understanding that had never been part of human educational systems. The only logical explanation for this coordinated global transformation was that it was being directed by intelligences that possessed comprehensive understanding of human civilization and unlimited access to advanced technologies. The withdrawal period was ending not because human development had reached predetermined milestones, but because external circumstances required the re-establishment of direct governance before human societies could develop beyond their intended parameters. The return of the Anunnaki was not a distant possibility preserved in ancient prophecies and conspiracy theories. It was an immediate reality that was already reshaping every aspect of human existence. The question was no longer whether they would return, but how humanity would respond when their presence could no longer be concealed behind institutional frameworks and technological misdirection. The evidence suggests that this revelation was carefully planned to occur gradually rather than through a single dramatic disclosure event. The modifications being implemented across all sectors of human civilization were designed to create familiarity with concepts and capabilities that would ease the psychological transition when direct contact was finally acknowledged. Humanity was being prepared not just technologically and institutionally, but psychologically and spiritually for a reunion with its creators that would mark the beginning of an entirely new phase of terrestrial civilization. The systems that had maintained human society throughout the withdrawal period had served their purpose, but they were rapidly becoming obsolete as the infrastructure for direct extraterrestrial governance was implemented. The transition would be managed to minimize disruption, but it would be comprehensive and irreversible. Humanity was about to discover its true place in a galactic civilization that had been patiently waiting for this moment since the day the first human drew breath in an Anunnaki laboratory hundreds of thousands of years ago. The transformation was accelerating beyond the carefully calculated timelines that had governed the withdrawal strategy for millennia. Something had changed in the cosmic environment that demanded immediate implementation of protocols that were originally scheduled for gradual deployment over several more decades. The precise astronomical calculations that had determined the optimal return window were being overridden by circumstances that required urgent action. Deep space monitoring stations detected energy signatures approaching from directions that had remained dark since the original departure. These were not the planned return vessels operating according to predetermined schedules. These were unscheduled arrivals that suggested external pressures were forcing an acceleration of the reintegration timeline. The signals indicated multiple fleets converging on our solar system from different sectors of the galaxy, suggesting that Earth's strategic importance extended far beyond its role as a resource extraction site. The genetic activation patterns occurring within the enhanced bloodlines were manifesting ahead of schedule and with greater intensity than the original programming had specified. Individuals who should have experienced gradual awakening over years were undergoing complete neurological transformation within weeks. Medical facilities that had been prepared to handle controlled activation sequences found themselves managing crisis interventions as dormant genetic systems came online simultaneously across entire family lineages. The communication networks that had been designed to facilitate gradual disclosure were overwhelmed by the volume and urgency of incoming transmissions. Messages that should have been filtered through multiple layers of institutional hierarchy were being transmitted directly to individuals who lacked the psychological preparation to process information that contradicted everything they believed about reality. The carefully maintained psychological barriers that separated public knowledge from classified truth were beginning to collapse under the weight of undeniable evidence. Financial markets worldwide experienced disruptions that exceeded the modeling parameters for any known economic scenario. Currencies fluctuated according to algorithms that incorporated variables that did not exist in terrestrial economic systems. Trading volumes surged beyond the processing capacity of existing exchange infrastructure as automated systems executed transactions that prepared for economic relationships with entities that possessed resources on planetary scales. The technological systems that had been gradually introducing advanced capabilities into human infrastructure suddenly began operating at full capacity without regard for the social disruption this would cause. Manufacturing facilities that had been producing conventional products for decades revealed hidden capabilities that could fabricate materials and devices using principles that had never been acknowledged in public scientific literature. The veil of technological limitation that had concealed true human capabilities was being stripped away as emergency protocols overrode security considerations. Military installations worldwide activated defense systems that had been constructed over decades but never publicly acknowledged. Underground facilities that appeared to be storage or research centers revealed themselves to be command and control networks capable of coordinating planetary defense operations. Personnel who had been assigned to routine administrative positions suddenly found themselves operating technologies that required training they had never received but somehow possessed. Religious institutions began accessing knowledge archives that contained information about humanity's true origins and purpose. Ancient texts that had been sealed for centuries were distributed to clergy members who were instructed to begin preparing their congregations for revelations that would fundamentally alter the relationship between humanity and the divine. Theological frameworks that had been developed over millennia were being rapidly restructured to accommodate truths that had been deliberately obscured since the withdrawal period. The ancient tablets were never myths, they were memories of a time when humanity knew its place in a cosmos far stranger and more magnificent than we dared imagine. Tonight, we have traced the bloodlines that connect our earliest civilizations to intelligences that shaped our DNA, guided our development, and never truly left. The evidence spans continents, millennia, and the very code embedded in our cells. The return is not coming. It has begun. The The question that remains is whether we will embrace our cosmic heritage or cling to the comfortable lie that we are alone. The choice may no longer be ours to make.